Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. There's a company that has been operating for 355 years. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment, because 355 years is not a long corporate lifespan. It is an inconceivable one. Companies do not last 3.5 centuries. Dynasties struggle to last that long. The company we're discussing tonight was founded when Isaac Newton was 27 years old and had not yet published his laws of motion. It predates the United States by more than a century. It operated continuously through the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the rise of the Internet. And in March of 2025, it filed for bankruptcy protection in a Canadian court, and by July of that year its last stores had closed, and one of the most extraordinary institutional lives in the history of commerce came to its end. The Hudson's Bay Company was not merely a business. At the peak of its power, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it was the effective government of a territory larger than Western Europe. A private commercial enterprise administering 1.5 million square miles of the North American interior through a network of trading posts and a hierarchy of fur trade officers who served as legislators, judges, police forces, and diplomats simultaneously. It controlled at various points more of the North American continent than any colonial government. It shaped the geography of what would become Canada with the decisiveness that no other institution matched. It employed the explorers who mapped the interior of the continent. It built the towns that became cities. It negotiated with indigenous nations across a territory so vast that its boundaries, when first established, were not known with certainty even by the men drawing the charter. It sold that territory, sold a continent essentially, in 1869 to the newly confederated government of Canada for $1.5 million, a transaction described as the largest real estate deal in history measured by land area, and the consequences of that sale are still being worked out in Canadian courts and politics today. The story of the Hudson's Bay Company is the story of the North American fur trade and of the beaver hat, which is perhaps a strange place to locate the origins of a major civilization, but which turns out to be exactly where they belong. It is the story of 2 French fur traders who got in trouble with the authorities in New France and ended up pitching their scheme to the King of England, and who thereby set in motion a chain of institutional consequences that neither of them lived to see completed. It is the story of the indigenous peoples of the subarctic, the Cree, the Dene, the Ojibwe, the Assiniboine, and many others, without whose knowledge, labour, and trade networks the entire enterprise would have collapsed within a decade, and whose relationship with the company was simultaneously a commercial partnership, a cultural disruption, and a geopolitical catastrophe from which the communities involved are still recovering. It is the story of the Métis people, the distinct nation born from the intermarriage of European fur traders and indigenous women, who were sold along with the land in 1869, and who resisted with a clarity and a courage that produced one of the defining moments in Canadian history. Tonight we're going to tell all of it. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Knowing this story is settling over different latitudes at once is something I always find quietly wonderful. Now dim the lights. Let the room go soft. There is a fire in this one too, metaphorically. The fires of the fur trade forts in the Canadian subarctic, burning through winters that would have killed anyone who had not learned from the people who had survived there for 10,000 years. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the beginning, to the beaver, and to why the beaver mattered so much to a civilization on the other side of an ocean that no one in the subarctic had ever visited. To understand the Hudson's Bay Company, you first have to understand the hat, specifically the broad-brimmed felt hat that was the defining status symbol of European fashion from roughly 1550 to 1850, 300 years during which no gentleman of any rank could appear in public without a hat, and no hat was worth wearing that was not made of beaver felt. The felt hat's dominance in European fashion was not arbitrary. Beaver felt possessed a combination of properties that no other material available at the time could match. It was dense and resilient, capable of being shaped and blocked into the elaborate forms that fashion demanded. It was naturally water-resistant, the oils in the beaver's underfur providing a degree of water repellency without any additional treatment. And it took dye uniformly, allowing hatters to produce the consistent colours that formal dress required. A well-made beaver felt hat could last a lifetime. A poorly made alternative, rabbit, wool, or the felts made from other furs, degraded quickly, lost its shape in rain, and identified its wearer as someone who could not afford the real thing. The problem was the beaver. European beaver populations had been hunted toward extinction by the end of the 16th century. The beaver that had once occupied the river systems of Britain, France, Germany, and Scandinavia was gone, victim of the same demand that was now driving the North American fur trade. By the time the beaver hat reached the apex of its fashion dominance, there were essentially no beavers left in Western Europe to supply the felt that made it possible. Russia and Scandinavia still had some populations, and the Russian fur trade supplied European hatters for a period, but those populations too were under pressure, and the prices were rising in ways that threatened to make the beaver hat unaffordable, even for those who could previously afford it. And then the explorers began reporting on North America. Jacques Cartier's voyages to the Saint. Lawrence in the 1530s made contact with indigenous peoples who were already wearing beaver robes, who had, in fact, been trading beaver furs among themselves and with other peoples for centuries before any European arrived. The beaver of North America was not the same species as the European beaver, but its fur was of equal or superior quality, and it was present in quantities that the earliest European observers found almost impossible to believe. The rivers of the subarctic drainage basin, the streams and lakes that fed into Hudson Bay from an area covering nearly 4 million square kilometres, were not merely beaver habitat. They were beaver civilization. The animals had built their dams and lodges and maintained their pond systems across the landscape for millennia, in populations so large and so dense that the first European trappers who arrived found them within easy distance of the water's edge, unafraid of humans because they had no experience of the organized, sustained hunting pressure that European wildlife had endured for centuries. The specific requirement of the felt hat trade added another dimension that proved crucial for the commercial relationship between Europeans and indigenous peoples. What the hatters needed was not simply raw beaver fur. They needed beaver fur in a specific condition, one in which the long guard hairs that covered the dense underfur had been worn away, leaving the soft, matted, felt-ready underfur exposed and easier to process. The way you got beaver fur into this condition was by wearing it. An indigenous family that had used a beaver robe as a winter blanket for a season or two had, entirely incidentally, produced exactly the product that European hatters needed. The furs that European traders valued most highly, that they called castor grey, greasy beaver, were the ones that had been worn. The ones most recently taken from the animal, castor sec, dry beaver, were worth less, required more processing, and produced a slightly inferior felt. This created a commercial relationship with a peculiar logic. Indigenous people who were using beaver robes in exactly the way they had always used them were producing a commodity that was more valuable to Europeans than the same commodity produced by the most diligent European trapper. The worn robe was the premium product. This made trade mutually beneficial in a specific and concrete way that went beyond the usual asymmetries of colonial commerce. At least in the early period, before the scale and intensity of the trade changed the dynamics so profoundly that the mutuality was overwhelmed by the disruption. The beaver hat's dominance in European fashion lasted, as noted, for approximately 3 centuries, and it drove the entire commercial logic of the North American fur trade across that period. When the fashion changed, when silk hats, cheaper to produce and not dependent on the dwindling beaver population, began to displace felt in European markets in the 1830s and 1840s, the economic foundation of the Hudson's Bay Company's monopoly was undermined in a way that no military challenge or commercial rival had managed to accomplish. A change in the tastes of European gentlemen about what to put on their heads reduced the beaver population of North America by tens of millions over 2 centuries and shaped the political geography of an entire continent. This is one of the more remarkable butterfly effects in the history of commerce. The specific human story of how the Hudson's Bay Company came to exist is one of the most improbable founding narratives in the history of corporate enterprise, and it begins not in England but in New France, with 2 men whose careers were models of the kind of boundary-crossing, allegiance-switching, consequence-ignoring opportunism that the colonial fur trade seemed to select for with particular intensity. Métis Chouard de Groseilliers was born in France around 1618 and came to New France as a young man, working initially with the Jesuit missionaries around the Great Lakes before transitioning to the fur trade. He was an experienced woodland traveller by the 1650s, fluent in Algonquian languages, comfortable with the specific physical demands of canoe travel through the subarctic, and deeply familiar with the indigenous trade networks that carried furs from the interior to the markets at Montreal and Quebec. In 1658 or 1659, he undertook an extended voyage into the interior with his much younger brother-in-law Pierre Esprit Radisson, travelling west of Lake Superior into territory that the French colonial establishment had only the vaguest awareness of. What they found there was a world of extraordinary beaver abundance, and more importantly, they came to understand something about the geography of the subarctic drainage system that would prove commercially revolutionary. What Groseilliers and Radisson grasped, partly from their own observations and partly from the Cree peoples they were trading with, was that the rivers and lakes of the subarctic interior drain not south into the St. Lawrence system, which the French traders controlled, but north into a great inland sea. An inland sea that could be reached directly by ship from England or France, bypassing the entire French colonial administrative apparatus that sat on the St. Lawrence and extracted its monopoly rents from every transaction. If you could sail your ship into Hudson Bay, you could trade directly with the indigenous peoples of the interior, cutting out the Montreal merchants, the colonial government, the canoe middlemen, and everyone else who stood between the fur and the European market. The overhead savings alone would be transformative. The strategic implications, that England could establish a commercial presence in the heart of North America without fighting its way past the French settlements on the St. Lawrence, were even larger. They returned to New France in 1660 at the head of a flotilla of 60 heavily loaded canoes, an arrival of such commercial significance that the governor of New France met them with cannon fire from the citadel at Quebec, a celebratory salute, a recognition of the extraordinary commercial achievement their voyage represented, and then the colonial administration confiscated their furs and fined them for trading without a license. This is one of those moments where the specific pettiness of bureaucratic authority in collision with individual achievement produces consequences that the bureaucrats had absolutely no intention of producing. Groseilliers and Radisson were not men who were going to accept this quietly. They appealed to the French court in Paris. The court ignored them. They went to Boston, where New England merchants showed polite interest but not enough money. They got captured by Dutch privateers crossing the Atlantic. They ended up in England in 1665, the year of the Great Plague, introduced themselves to the circles around Charles II, and eventually secured an audience with Prince Rupert, the king's cousin, a German-born professional soldier and occasional naval commander who was one of the more enterprising investors of the Restoration Court. Rupert understood what they were offering immediately. He organised a consortium of investors, secured the interest of the king, and equipped 2 ships for a voyage to test the proposition. The ships were named the Eaglet and the Nonsuch, small, underpowered vessels by any standard, the kind of ships that the term decrepit was applied to in contemporary accounts. The Eaglet, with Radisson aboard, was forced back by storms somewhere between Ireland and Newfoundland. The Nonsuch, with Groseilliers, continued. Its captain was Zachariah Gillam of Boston, a man who kept a detailed log of the voyage that preserves the specific texture of what it was like to sail those waters for the first time. The bergs of ice, the polar bears on the shore islands, the desolate beauty of the subarctic coast in late summer. The Nonsuch reached James Bay in September 1668, at the southern end of Hudson Bay. Groseilliers and Gillam made contact with Cree people on the shore, established the season's trading relationship, wintered over in conditions that the Europeans among them found extremely challenging, and returned to England the following year with a cargo of furs sufficient to demonstrate that the proposition was real. Charles II signed the Royal Charter on May 2, 1670. The story of how it came to be signed is not quite finished, because the men who made it possible, Radisson and Groseilliers, were not done being remarkable. The subsequent careers of the 2 men who founded the HBC are themselves a compressed history of the Anglo-French competition for North America. Groseilliers, older and less temperamentally suited to the political manoeuvring that the post-1670 situation required, largely retired from active involvement in the company's operations after the charter was signed. He returned to New France in 1674, made his peace with the French colonial authorities, and spent his remaining years in the country where his commercial career had begun. The dates of his death are not precisely known. Radisson's career after the charter signing was considerably more turbulent. He sailed to Hudson Bay for the company in the early 1670s, helping to establish the first trading posts and making the connections with indigenous peoples that would be essential to the company's commercial success. Then, in 1674, he too returned to French service, apparently at the invitation of French agents who recognized that his knowledge of Hudson Bay was now of military and commercial strategic value to France. He spent several years in French service, including a voyage in 1682 that led a French expedition to the Nelson River at the south end of Hudson Bay and established a French presence there that directly challenged the HBC's monopoly. He captured an English ship and a cargo of furs before the French colonial authorities, dissatisfied with how the proceeds were being divided, effectively cheated him of his share. At this point, Radisson did something that was either a masterpiece of opportunism or a genuine expression of where his loyalties actually lay, or both. He returned to English service. He sailed to London in 1684, negotiated a deal with the HBC committee, that gave him a pension and employment, and then sailed back to Hudson Bay to capture from the French the very post he had helped establish 2 years earlier, taking it from his own nephew, the son of Groseilliers, who was in command of the French garrison. He spent the rest of his working life in HBC employ, making several more voyages to Hudson Bay before retiring on his company pension. He died in London around 1710 at approximately 70 years old, a man who had served France, England, and then France and then England again, with a flexibility that was entirely characteristic of the specific world of colonial commercial competition in which he had spent his life. A world where national allegiance was real, but where it competed constantly with professional survival and personal advantage. The story of Radisson and Groseilliers is, in miniature, the story of the entire Atlantic colonial world, a story of men who knew things that governments needed to know, who could make things happen that governments needed to have happen, and who leveraged that knowledge and capacity with whatever political authority was willing to pay for it, switching sides when the payment terms changed, leaving behind them as their most durable legacy not the specific national interest they claimed to be serving at any given moment, but the institutional structures, the trading company, the route to Hudson Bay, the commercial relationship with the Cree, that persisted long after any particular allegiance had been forgotten. Charles II signed the Royal Charter on May 2, 1670. The document is one of the most expansive grants of corporate power in the history of English law. The full name of the company it created was the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay. The word adventurers used in its 17th century sense of investors who risked capital in a commercial venture, not in the modern sense of people seeking excitement. The charter granted the company the exclusive right to trade in all the lands watered by rivers draining into Hudson Bay. It gave the company powers that went far beyond commercial regulation: the right to make laws, the right to judge and punish those within its territory, the right to make war and peace with non-Christian peoples, the right to exercise essentially sovereign authority over a territory whose full extent was not specified in the charter because it was not known, the territory that came to be called Rupert's Land, named after the prince who'd been its primary advocate and who became the company's first governor, was, at its full extent, approximately 3.9 million square kilometres. This is an area larger than the entirety of Western Europe. It encompassed what are now the provinces of Manitoba, most of Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, southern Nunavut, and large portions of Ontario and Quebec, as well as territory extending south into what are now the American states of Minnesota and North Dakota. The charter described it as all the drainage basin of Hudson Bay, all the lands whose rivers and streams emptied into the bay, which was a geographic definition of sufficient precision that the territory could be mapped, but which the men who wrote the charter had no way of knowing, would encompass nearly 40% of the modern landmass of Canada. The 18 investors who became the original shareholders of the Hudson's Bay Company were each granted a proportional share of the profits in exchange for their capital. Prince Rupert held the largest share. The company was structured as what we would now call a joint stock company. The shareholders received dividends in proportion to their investment. The management was appointed by and accountable to the shareholders, and the whole enterprise was in principle distinct from the personal finances of any individual investor. This was a relatively new institutional form in 1670. The East India Company had pioneered it a few decades earlier, and the HBC was consciously modelled on the East India Company's example. The specific innovation of the joint stock company, that investors could share in the profits of a large commercial enterprise without being personally liable for its debts, and without any single investor needing to bear the entire capital risk, was the institutional mechanism that made enterprises of this scale possible, and the HBC's 3-century longevity is in some sense a testament to the durability of the institutional form as much as to any particular quality of management. The world that the Charter described as the company's commercial domain was not an empty land waiting for European exploitation. It had been inhabited for approximately 8 to 10,000 years, since the glaciers retreated from the subarctic following the last ice age, by peoples whose mastery of the specific environmental conditions of the subarctic drainage basin was so complete and so deeply held that it was, from the European perspective, simply invisible. What the Europeans saw when they arrived at the shores of Hudson Bay was wilderness, a landscape empty of the markers that European civilization used to identify human presence. Cities, farms, roads, enclosed fields, written records, stone buildings. What was actually there was a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, organized not around sedentary agriculture, but around the systematic mobile exploitation of a cold-climate ecological system, whose rhythms and resources had been understood and managed by its inhabitants for 10,000 years. The Cree peoples who lived around the southern shores of Hudson Bay and James Bay, the people Groselius and the Nonsuch crew first encountered in the winter of 1668, were the company's primary trading partners in the early period of its history, and the relationship they developed with the HBC was one of the most consequential indigenous European commercial relationships in the history of North America. The Cree were experienced traders before the Europeans arrived. They had participated in indigenous trade networks stretching from the Arctic coast to the Great Lakes for centuries, and they understood the logic of exchange, the negotiation of rates, the management of supply and demand, the cultivation of trading relationships as social and political bonds as well as commercial ones, with a sophistication that European observers consistently underestimated. The Cree brought beaver pelts to the trading post that the company built on the shores of Hudson Bay, and the company brought European manufactured goods that the Cree found genuinely useful and genuinely desirable. Iron tools and weapons that were sharper and more durable than stone alternatives, wool cloth that was warmer than most available alternatives, copper kettles that were lighter and more versatile than clay pots, and firearms that transformed the hunting and warfare options of peoples who acquired them relative to those who did not. This last item, the gun, is the one whose consequences were most immediately dramatic and most geopolitically transformative, because the differential access to firearms between peoples who had established trading relationships with Europeans and those who had not altered the balance of power among indigenous nations in ways that drove enormous population movements and political reorganizations across the interior of the continent. The peoples of the interior who could not directly access European trade goods because they were not in contact with European traders sought access through intermediaries, or were driven westward by the expansion of peoples who were better supplied. The social geography of North America in the 17th and 18th centuries was remade by the fur trade, in ways whose full consequences took generations to become visible. The HBC's initial trading strategy was one that its critics, and there were many, including competitors who found its comfortable position infuriating, called sleeping by the frozen sea. The company built its posts on the shores of Hudson Bay itself and waited for indigenous peoples to bring their furs down the river systems to the posts. York Factory, established in the 1680s on the west shore of the bay, at the mouth of the Hayes River, became the company's principal trading post, its main point of entry for ships from England and its main depot for the furs that indigenous traders brought in from the interior. Moose Factory, Fort Albany, and a handful of other posts on the shores of James Bay completed the initial network. The model was simple: maintain the posts, stock them with trade goods brought from England each summer on the annual supply ship, and rely on the indigenous trading networks to bring the furs to you. The criticism of this approach, that the company was passive, that it was relying on indigenous effort and knowledge rather than actively exploring and developing the territory it claimed, was accurate as a description of strategy, though it missed the reason the strategy made commercial sense. The alternative, going inland, building a network of interior posts, sending men out to trade in the villages and camps of the interior, was what the French had been doing for decades through the system of coureurs des bois, the unlicensed woods runners who travelled the interior river systems by canoe and who formed the commercial intelligence network of New France. That system worked, but it was expensive, difficult to control, and logistically demanding in ways that required an enormous supporting infrastructure. The HBC's coastal model was cheaper to operate, easier to manage from London, and less dependent on the specific physical and linguistic skills that travelling in the subarctic interior required. It was also, in the early period, entirely adequate to the supply of furs that indigenous trading networks were generating. There was no commercial reason to go inland when the furs were coming to you. The company maintained this coastal model from 1670 until 1774, a century of relative stasis broken only by a series of exploratory expeditions that the company funded partly out of curiosity and partly out of an awareness that the original Royal Charter had specified the search for a northwest passage to the Pacific as one of the company's obligations. The Northwest Passage, the sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Arctic archipelago above North America, was one of the great geographical obsessions of the European maritime tradition. A navigable northern sea route to Asia would have transformed global commerce by eliminating the enormously long and dangerous routes around the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn, and European monarchs and investors have been funding attempts to find it since the 16th century. Henry Hudson's 1610 voyage, which discovered the bay that bears his name, was itself one of these attempts. Hudson had sailed into the bay believing it might be the passage, had wintered over, and had been set adrift by his mutinous crew in the spring of 1611, dying in the great inland sea whose commercial exploitation his voyage had made possible. The HBC's charter specifically included the search for the passage as part of its mandate, both because the passage was commercially desirable if it existed, and because the Royal Charter needed a public justification for the monopoly it was granting that went beyond the nakedly commercial. The HBC funded several expeditions in search of the passage during the 18th century. James Knight, the same factor who had sent Thanadeltha on her diplomatic mission, organised an expedition in 1719 to search for the passage from the northern shore of Hudson Bay. Knight was approximately 70 years old when he departed on this voyage, his motivation a combination of genuine geographical curiosity and the reports he'd been receiving from indigenous traders of copper deposits and other riches in the northern interior. He never returned. His ships were wrecked on Marble Island off the northwest coast of Hudson Bay, and the entire expedition, approximately 40 men, died over the following months, likely of scurvy and exposure, their fate not established until a subsequent expedition found their remains 50 years later. The Inuit oral tradition preserved the memory of the last survivors. 2 men seen by Inuit observers crawling on their hands and knees in the final stages of starvation. The company's most consequential exploration in its early period was the overland journey of Samuel Hearne, who made 3 attempts between 1769 and 1772 to reach the Arctic Ocean overland from Hudson Bay, guided by the Chipewyan leader Matanabi. who was one of the most important Indigenous figures in the company's history. Hearn's first two attempts failed, largely because he was travelling without adequate Indigenous guidance through terrain that European geographical assumptions had prepared him for very poorly. His third attempt, with Matonabbee as his guide and with a large party of Chipewyan and Cree travellers, reached the Coppermine River and followed it to its mouth at the Arctic Ocean in July 1771. The journey confirmed several important geographical facts: that there was no navigable northwest passage in the latitudes the company was interested in, that the Coppermine River led not to the gold and copper deposits in commercial quantities that optimists had imagined, but to a modest copper outcrop of limited economic value, and that the geography of the subarctic interior was vastly more complex and extensive than any map the company possessed had suggested. The Coppermine expedition also witnessed the Bloody Falls massacre, an event that Hearn described in his journal with the detail and a moral discomfort that makes the account one of the most disturbing in the literature of subarctic exploration. Matonabbee's Chipewyan companions, encountering a camp of Copper Inuit at the falls, killed approximately 20 people, men, women and children, in an attack that Hearn was powerless to prevent and that he watched with helpless anguish, recording in his journal the specific details of individual deaths with a specificity that suggests both that he could not look away and that he felt the obligation to witness accurately. The massacre was not an action of the HBC, but Hearn was an HBC employee, Matonabbee was an HBC ally, and the encounter represents one of the places where the specific human consequences of the commercial relationships the company had created and maintained were visible in their most brutal form. The company maintained this coastal model from 1670 until 1774. The company maintained this coastal model from 1670 until 1774, when competitive pressure from inland traders finally forced it to build its first interior post at Cumberland House, in what is now northern Saskatchewan. That is over a century of essentially unchanged commercial strategy, which tells you something about both the stability of the model and the insularity of the London committee that oversaw operations. The insularity was not simply laziness. It was the natural product of an organisation governed from London by men who had never visited the territory they administered, whose knowledge of the subarctic came from the annual reports of their factors and from the conversation of the occasional Indigenous visitor or experienced trader who appeared in London, and who had no mechanism for the kind of direct operational knowledge that would have pushed them toward change. The critique that the company was asleep by the frozen sea was made by its rivals, and by critics who wanted the territory open to broader settlement and exploration. The company's own assessment was that it was doing exactly what it needed to do, efficiently and profitably, and that the critics were either competitors trying to undermine its monopoly, or enthusiasts for exploration who did not have to pay the costs of the enterprises they were proposing. The first serious challenge to the company's existence came not from commercial competitors, but from the French military, and it came sooner and more violently than the comfortable investors who had signed the 1670 Charter could have anticipated. France and England were in a complex geopolitical competition for dominance in North America throughout the late 17th century, and the Hudson's Bay Company's establishment of a commercial presence in the subarctic interior, a presence that, if consolidated, would give England effective control of the entire northern part of the continent, was something that New France could not ignore. In March of 1686, the French sent an overland expeditionary force under the command of the Chevalier de Troyes from Montreal, more than 1,000 kilometres through winter wilderness, on snowshoes and by canoe through the spring break-up, a journey whose physical demands were extraordinary by any standard. With de Troyes as his second in command was Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, the the most formidable military officer New France had yet produced, and the man who would become the HBC's greatest adversary. The expedition arrived at James Bay in late May, and within weeks it had captured every HBC post on the southern shores of the bay: Moose Factory, Rupert House, Fort Albany. With a combination of speed, tactical intelligence, and d'Iberville's personal courage that the small English garrisons of these posts had no realistic hope of matching. The trading goods, the stored furs, and the cannon were all seized. The English prisoners were sent to Charlton Island to wait for the company's supply ship. D'Iberville's subsequent career in Hudson Bay reads like the kind of story that seems too dramatic to be historically accurate, and is in fact historically accurate. He captured York Factory in 1694, held it for a year before English forces retook it, then returned in 1697 for the most remarkable episode of his remarkable career. Commanding a French squadron tasked with taking York Factory definitively, d'Iberville encountered a superior English naval force in the bay, 3 warships of the Royal Navy, any one of which should have been capable of driving him off, and in a running battle in the ice-choked waters of Hudson Bay, managed to sink one English ship, capture another, and drive the third off, then took York Factory by siege. The engagement is known as the Battle of Hudson's Bay, and it remains the largest naval battle in the history of the North American Arctic. D'Iberville accomplished it with a ship that was damaged, a crew that was reduced, and a tactical audacity that the formal discipline of the Royal Navy was not equipped to match. The French held the company's post for varying periods through the 1690s and into the first decade of the 18th century, and the company's survival during this period was genuinely uncertain. The English posts changed hands repeatedly, captured, retaken, captured again, in a seesaw of small-scale military operations that was expensive for both sides and resolved nothing decisively. What eventually resolved it was not military action but diplomacy. The Treaty of Utrecht of 1713, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession, included among its many provisions the restoration of Hudson Bay and its post to England. France accepted, in exchange for other territorial concessions, the loss of its claim to the subarctic trade. The company got its post back, its monopoly confirmed, and a period of relative commercial stability that would last until the 1780s, when a new threat emerged, this time not from France, but from Montreal. York Factory, after its restoration following Utrecht, became one of the most extraordinary establishments in the history of North American commerce. A place that was simultaneously a warehouse, a government office, a hospital, a supply depot, and the administrative capital of the largest private landholding on Earth, all packed into a cluster of wooden buildings on a tidal flat at the edge of the subarctic. The factory, the word used for a trading post derived from the title of factor for the man who managed it, was built on permafrost, which meant that every building sat on a foundation that was frozen solid through the winter and partially thawed in summer, requiring a continuous engineering attention to the building's stability that the men stationed there had to maintain alongside all their other duties. The ground around the factory was perpetually wet in summer, a bog of muskeg and standing water that required the men to walk on boardwalks, laid between buildings to avoid sinking to their knees. In winter, temperatures regularly fell to -40 Celsius or below, and the wind off the bay added a wind chill that the factors described in their reports to London with the precision that suggests they wanted the London Committee to understand what they were asking their employees to endure. The men who staffed the HBC's posts in this period were recruited primarily from the Orkney Islands of northern Scotland, a choice that reflected both the company's recruitment geography since the annual supply ships stopped at Stromness in Orkney on their way out and returning from Hudson Bay, and a more deliberate assessment of what kind of men survived and worked effectively in subarctic conditions. The Orcadians were experienced with cold, with small boat work in rough northern waters, with the specific physical demands of a life organized around weather and isolation. They were also, the company found, more inclined than English or Scottish mainland men to stay in the trade for multiple seasons rather than returning home at the first opportunity. They were essential to the company's operations, and they knew it, and the surviving correspondence of the period occasionally reveals them using that knowledge to negotiate terms with the London Committee that the committee found somewhat exasperating. The annual rhythms of York Factory organised the entire commercial system of the subarctic. Each spring, as the ice broke up on the Hayes River and the inland waterways opened, the indigenous trading parties that had been living on the land through the winter began to converge on the bay. The traders came from hundreds of miles into the interior, from the Churchill River, from the Saskatchewan, from the Assiniboine, paddling canoes loaded with the winter's harvest of beaver and other furs, arriving at York Factory over a period of weeks in a gathering that the factory's factor presided over, with a combination of commercial calculation and diplomatic care. The trading ceremonies that preceded each transaction were not formalities to be hurried through. They were essential expressions of the relationship between the company and its indigenous partners. The smoking of pipes, the exchange of gifts, the speeches of welcome and response, the formalized negotiation of prices that had been conducted in essentially the same terms for decades, and that both sides understood as a ritual renewal of the commercial alliance as much as a simple business transaction. Before we describe the made beaver system in detail, the specific human stories of the early trading period deserve more space than a summary account provides. Among the most remarkable figures of the early HBC era was a Chippewayan woman named Thanadeltha, who was born around 1697 in what is now northern Manitoba, and who, in a brief period of activity between 1714 and 1717, was more consequential to the company's commercial expansion than most of its own officers. Thanadeltha had been captured by Cree raiders in 1713, a young woman separated from her people by the intermittent warfare between the Cree and the Chippewayan that the fur trade's differential distribution of European weapons had intensified. She escaped from her Cree captors the following year and made her way, nearly alone and in desperate condition, to the HBC post at York Factory. The company factor, James Knight, recognised immediately that she was an extraordinary asset. The Chippewayan, the Dean-speaking people who occupied the vast territory to the northwest of Hudson Bay, had not yet been drawn into the HBC's trading network. They were rich in beaver and in other furs, but they were at war with the Cree middlemen who controlled the southern approaches to the bay, and that war was preventing them from reaching the English post directly. Thanadeltha offered to serve as an interpreter and a peace broker, to travel north and west with an HBC expedition, and to negotiate between the Cree and the Chippewayan a peace that would allow both peoples to trade at the English posts. What followed is one of the most extraordinary episodes of diplomatic achievement in the history of the North American fur trade. The expedition she guided north from York Factory in 1715 was physically brutal, a winter journey on foot and by snowshoe through subarctic terrain in conditions that killed several members of the party and brought the rest to the edge of collapse. When the expedition reached a Chippewayan camp to find that recent Cree raids had made the Chippewayan hostile and unwilling to talk, Thanadeltha essentially took personal charge of the diplomatic situation. She went alone into the Chippewayan camp, spoke to her own people, persuaded them to negotiate, arranged the meeting between Cree and Chippewayan leaders, and presided over the peace ceremony with an authority and a composure that James Knight, reading the reports when the expedition returned, described in his journal with an admiration that was genuine and almost incredulous. She had achieved, in a matter of days, a diplomatic settlement that the HBC had been hoping to accomplish for years. She died of illness in 1717, at approximately 20 years old, at York Factory. Knight described her death with a grief that suggested the professional loss and the personal loss were both real. Without Thanadeltha, the peace she had brokered might not have held. With her, the Chipewyan entered the HBC trading network and became among the most important partners in the company's northern expansion. Her name appears on very few monuments. The fur trade was not historically generous with monuments to the indigenous women whose knowledge and labour were essential to its functioning. The unit of account in this commercial world was the made beaver, a standard beaver pelt of specified quality against which all other goods were priced. A pound of tobacco was worth 1 made beaver, a gun was worth 14 made beavers, a blanket was worth 7. The company published standard price lists that theoretically governed all transactions, though the actual negotiations at the post deviated from these lists in ways that the factors were reported to London with varying degrees of transparency. The made beaver was not a physical object that changed hands in every transaction. It was an accounting unit, a common measure that allowed the complex bartering of many different commodities into a coherent accounting system. The concept of a standard unit of account for trade was not a European innovation imposed on indigenous peoples. Indigenous trade networks had their own units of account and their own pricing conventions. But the made beaver was the HBC's specific formalization of this principle, and it governed the company's accounts for nearly 2 centuries. The standard of living at a factor's post in the early 18th century was not comfortable by European standards, but it was not as desperate as the physical conditions might suggest. The company sent out substantial quantities of provisions on its annual ships: flour, salt beef, salt pork, dried peas, butter, chocolate, tea, and the occasional luxury, alongside the trade goods, and supplemented these with whatever the local environment provided: goose and duck and ptarmigan in season, fish from the Hayes River, caribou and moose from the surrounding country, harvested by the indigenous people who worked around the post, and by the factors and servants themselves. The food was monotonous and the isolation was total. The annual supply ship was the only connection to the outside world for 11 months of the year, and letters sent to London in September would not be answered until the following summer at the earliest. Men stationed at the post for multiple seasons developed the specific psychological adaptations to isolation that institutional psychiatry has studied in polar and remote communities ever since. The intensification of small social conflicts, the elaboration of routine into ceremony, the minute observation of environmental change, the first crocus through the snow, the first geese overhead in spring, as a temporal anchor in a world where the weeks otherwise blurred into each other. The competitors who arose to challenge the HBC's monopoly in the second half of the 18th century were not foreign powers but fellow British subjects. The merchants of Montreal, many of them Scottish Highlanders who had come to Canada in the wake of the British conquest of New France in 1759, and who had absorbed the French commercial knowledge of the interior river systems, along with the colonial infrastructure the conquest had delivered. These men, the partnerships and syndicates that eventually coalesced into the Northwest Company by the early 1780s, were building on the legacy of the French coureurs des bois, the unlicensed woods runners whose knowledge of the interior had made New France commercially viable for a century. They spoke French, they travelled by birch-bark canoe, they hired French-Canadian voyageurs as their labour force, and they went where the fur was rather than waiting for the fur to come to them. The voyageurs who paddled the canoe brigades of the Northwest Company are among the most physically extraordinary workers in the history of North American labour. These were French-Canadian men, many of them small and compact, the physique suited to the specific demands of the work, who paddled birch-bark canoes for 10 to 18 hours a day in season, maintaining a stroke rate of approximately 40 to 60 strokes per minute, portaging their canoes and the heavy bales of goods and furs they carried over every stretch of water that was impassable by boat. A standard canoe load was about 400 pounds of cargo, and the voyageur who portaged that load across a carrying place, sometimes hundreds of meters long over rough terrain, typically did so in multiple trips, carrying 90-pound bales one at a time and returning for the next. The grand total of what a voyageur carried in a day of portaging could amount to several hundred pounds, moved over miles of difficult ground. They were paid in goods, tobacco, cloth, food, as well as wages, and they maintained a distinctive culture of song, story, and competitive bravado that made the canoe brigades of the Northwest Company among the most visible and most culturally distinctive labour forces in the history of Canadian commerce. The Northwest Company's competitive strategy was the opposite of the HBC's, but before describing what that competition looked like, it is worth spending time with the specific physical world of the interior fur trade, the world of rivers and portages and canoe brigades and winter posts, because the material reality of how furs actually moved from the subarctic interior to the markets of London is one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements of the pre-modern world. The birchbark canoe of the fur trade was an indigenous technology of such sophisticated adaptation to the specific demands of the Canadian Shields River and lake system that European technology of the period had nothing comparable to offer. The Great Canot de Métis, master canoes, used on the main water highways between Montreal and the interior, were approximately 12 metres long, capable of carrying 4 tons of cargo and sufficiently light that they could be portaged by their crews of 8 to 10 men over the rocky carrying places that interrupted every river route. The portage was the fundamental physical test of the fur trade, the carrying of boats, bales and supplies from one water to the next, over terrain that varied from a few minutes' walk to hours of rough going through rock and muskeg. The standard portage load was 2 90-pound bales, carried with a leather tumplin across the forehead and down the back, a method of weight distribution that allowed large loads to be carried over rough terrain with a degree of speed and stability that backpack systems have never quite matched. A voyageur who could carry 3 bales and 270 pounds over a difficult portage was considered exceptional. Men who could do this were known and celebrated in the specific culture of the canoe brigades, where the physical hierarchy of strength and endurance was as clearly defined and as socially important as any formal rank. The specific songs that the voyageurs sang while paddling, the chanson de voyageur that regulated the paddle stroke at 40 to 60 beats per minute, and that provided the social rhythm of a working day that lasted from 3 in the morning until 9 at night, are one of the few elements of fur trade material culture that has been preserved in a form accessible to modern audiences. Hundreds of these songs were collected in the 19th century, their words and melodies recorded before the tradition that produced them had entirely disappeared. They range from the comic to the romantic to the genuinely beautiful, and they carry within them the specific texture of a working life organised around rivers and portages and the seasonal rhythms of the fur trade in ways that no other document quite preserves. The voyageur who paddled from Montreal to Lake Athabasca and back in a single season, a journey of approximately 6,000 kilometres, was doing something that required not only extraordinary physical capacity, but a specific psychological adaptation to months of continuous motion, discomfort and danger that the songs were partly designed to maintain. The York Factory Express, the communication and personnel link between York Factory on Hudson Bay and the Pacific Coast posts of the Columbia Department, was the most spectacular of the HBC's transport operations, and the one that most clearly illustrates the scale of what the company was actually managing. Running annually from spring through fall, the Express carried mail, financial dispatches, newly hired employees heading west, and retiring employees heading east over a route of approximately 6,700 kilometres from Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River to York Factory on Hudson Bay, combining river travel, portages, mountain crossings, and the specific seasonal timing required to cross the Rocky Mountains before the passes closed with snow. The men who ran the Express in its prime, the 1830s and 1840s, were travelling at an average pace of about 40 kilometres per day across terrain that included the full spectrum of conditions the continent offered, from the glacial lakes of the Canadian Shield to the mountain passes of the Rockies to the river systems of the Columbia watershed. The Express was discontinued after 1846, when the Oregon boundary settlement made Fort Vancouver American territory, and the Columbia route no longer led to British-held land. Its abandonment was one of the clearest markers of the company's contraction from its continental peak. The Northwest Company's competitive strategy was the opposite of the HBC's. Where the HBC waited at the bay for the fur to come to it, the Northwesters went to the fur. They built a chain of interior posts reaching west and north from Montreal, connected by the river systems of the continent's interior, with their great entrepot at Fort William on Lake Superior, where the Montreal-based partners met the wintering partners who managed the interior posts each summer, exchanging trade goods for furs in a rendezvous that was simultaneously a commercial transaction and a social festival lasting several weeks, and consuming quantities of rum and roast meat that the surviving accounts describe with a relish that suggests the participants found it among the more enjoyable events of their year. The Northwest Company's geographical reach was extraordinary. Alexander Mackenzie reached the Arctic Ocean overland in 1789, following the river that bears his name. In 1793, he crossed the Rocky Mountains and reached the Pacific Ocean, the first European to cross the continent north of Mexico. David Thompson mapped the entire Columbia River system. Simon Fraser followed the river that bears his name to the Pacific. The Northwest Company's explorers mapped the interior of North America with a completeness that the HBC, with its coastal stay-at-home strategy, could not match. The competition between the two companies was not merely commercial. By the early 19th century it had become a matter of violence, a guerrilla war conducted across thousands of miles of wilderness, with the specific focus of conflict not on the fur trade itself but on pemmican. Pemmican is dried buffalo meat mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, pressed into cakes and stored in rawhide bags, and it was the standard emergency ration and travel food of the western subarctic and plains trade. It was nutritionally dense, preserved well in cold conditions, and could be produced in large quantities during the buffalo hunts that the Métis people of the Red River conducted twice yearly. The Northwest Company's interior network depended on pemmican for its provisioning. Without the Métis-produced pemmican depots that supplied the canoe brigades and the interior posts, the company's logistical system would have collapsed. The HBC understood this dependence, and when it acquired rights to the Red River area and established the Selkirk Settlement, a farming colony intended to put the Red River district into productive agricultural use, also found itself in a position to control the pemmican supply. In 1814, the HBC governor of the Red River colony issued the Pemmican Proclamation, which prohibited the export of pemmican and other provisions from the colony. The proclamation was, from one perspective, a reasonable measure to ensure that the new settlement had adequate food supplies through the winter. From the perspective of the Northwest Company and the Métis hunters who supplied it, it was an economic attack on their livelihood and an assertion of HBC authority over territory that the Northwesters had been effectively administering for decades. The conflict escalated over the following 2 years through a series of increasingly violent incidents. But to understand what was actually at stake in the Pemmican War, you have to understand the Red River settlement itself, because the Red River colony was not simply a convenient commercial outpost. It was an attempted civilization, a vision of what the HBC's territorial holding could become, and it was the creation of one of the most idealistic and most practically disastrous men in the company's history. Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk, was a Scottish nobleman who'd been watching with horror the clearances of Highland Scotland, the forced removal of crofting communities from the land their families had occupied for generations to make way for the sheep farming that was more profitable for the landlords. He was genuinely moved by the human suffering of the clearances, genuinely idealistic about the possibility of creating new communities for displaced Highlanders in North America, and genuinely wealthy enough to pursue his idealism with practical resources. He purchased a substantial share in the Hudson's Bay Company, specifically to obtain access to a land grant in the Red River area, where he intended to establish an agricultural colony for displaced Scots and Irish. The land grant he received, and 16,000 square miles of the Red River Valley and its surroundings, an area 5 times the size of Scotland, was, by the terms of the HBC's charter, the company's to grant. Whether it was morally or practically sensible to try to establish an agricultural colony in the middle of a territory that the Northwest Company regarded as essential to its supply lines, that the Métis regarded as their homeland, and that the indigenous peoples of the area had been inhabiting for millennia, these questions either did not occur to Selkirk, or he believed they could be managed. The first settlers arrived at the Red River in 1812, after a journey that was itself a demonstration of the colony's practical difficulties. A transatlantic crossing followed by a Hudson Bay passage, followed by an overland journey of hundreds of miles, arriving too late to plant crops, requiring emergency provisioning by the HBC through the first winter, in conditions that killed several settlers. The colony that eventually established itself on the banks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, in what is now the site of the city of Winnipeg, was a more modest thing than Selkirk's vision had imagined, but a more remarkable thing than its critics acknowledged. European settlers, Scots, Irish, French-Canadian, learned from the Métis how to plant crops in the northern climate, how to manage the annual spring flooding of the Red River that could destroy a season's preparation in days, how to hunt buffalo on the plains that lay to the west. They adopted the strip lot system of land tenure that the Métis had developed. Long, narrow plots running back from the river bank, giving each family river access while maximizing the number of farms along the water. They built churches, organized schools, established the beginnings of civic life. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Red River settlement had become a real community of several thousand people, diverse in its ethnic composition, precarious in its economic foundations, distinctive in its specific combination of Indigenous, Métis, French-Canadian, Scottish, and English elements. The conflict escalated over the following 2 years through a series of increasingly violent incidents: the seizure of Northwest Company forts, the destruction of HBC property, armed confrontations between the employees of the two companies, culminating in the Battle of Sevenoaks on June 19, 1816. Sevenoaks was not a large battle by any military standard. About 60 men on each side, lasting perhaps 15 minutes, but its consequences were enormously disproportionate to its scale. A party of Métis riders, led by Cuthbert Grant, intercepted a group of HBC men led by Robert Semple, the governor of the Red River Colony. An argument began. Shots were fired. When it was over, Semple and 20 of his men were dead, and one Métis man had been killed. The Métis who survived celebrated what they experienced as a decisive assertion of their right to their own country. The song composed immediately afterward, La Chanson de la Grenouillère, celebrated the victory in terms that made clear the participants understood it as a founding moment of Métis political identity, not merely a commercial skirmish. The British government, alarmed by the escalating violence and the prospect of sustained warfare in the Canadian interior, intervened. Parliamentary pressure on both companies resulted in a forced merger in 1821, conducted under the retained name of the Hudson's Bay Company, which absorbed the Northwest Company and its network of interior posts. The merger was transformative in several ways simultaneously. It gave the HBC what it had always lacked: direct access to the interior through the chain of Northwest Company posts that extended to the Pacific coast. It gave the Northwest Company's wintering partners, many of them skilled and experienced men with deep knowledge of the interior, a future within the combined organization. And it cleared the way for a new kind of management, the kind exemplified by the man who would become the most powerful individual in the history of the company. George Simpson arrived in North America in 1820, sent out by the London Committee as a contingency replacement for the HBC's existing North American governor, in case that man was arrested by the Northwest Company, a real possibility given the state of the conflict. He was a small, red-haired Scotsman of approximately 30, born in northern Scotland to unmarried parents of different social classes, educated in mathematics, trained as a sugar broker's clerk in London, and entirely without experience in the North American fur trade. He had never been in the subarctic. He had never paddled a canoe. He had never spent a winter at a trading post, never negotiated with an Indigenous chief, never managed the specific logistics of the canoe brigade system. By the ordinary standards of professional qualification for the role he was assuming, he was completely unsuited to it. He turned out to be, arguably, the most effective administrator in the history of the North American fur trade. What Simpson possessed that his competitors and predecessors often lacked was the specific combination of quantitative intelligence and physical stamina that the efficient management of a continental trading empire required. He understood the accounts. He could read a set of trade figures and identify waste and inefficiency with a precision that the men who had been running the operation for years had apparently not been applying. And he was willing, even eager, to travel the distances necessary to see the operation on the ground rather than managing it from reports. His journeys through the HBC territory became legendary in their ambition and in the pace at which he conducted them. He travelled by canoe in summer and by dog sled in winter, covering distances that would have been impressive for a younger man in better physical condition, arriving at posts with a theatrical suddenness, a blast from a bugle as his canoe rounded the last bend, bagpipes playing, the men in the lead canoe standing at attention, designed to communicate to the employees of remote posts that the governor had not forgotten them, and that his standards were being applied in their vicinity as surely as at York Factory. The efficiency campaign that Simpson conducted following the 1821 merger was ruthless in its logic and in its execution. He rationalized the combined company's network, closing duplicate posts where the two companies had been competing directly across the canoe from each other, reducing the labour force that the competitive years had inflated to levels the unified monopoly no longer needed, standardising the trade practices across the now vastly extended network, and replacing the Northwest Company's canoe brigade system east of the Rocky Mountains with the York boat, a heavier, more durable, less romantic but more efficient vessel, derived from the Orkney fishing boats that the Orkney employees knew how to build and sail. The canoe was faster and more manoeuvrable, but the York boat could carry more cargo with fewer skilled paddlers, and efficiency was what Simpson was after. He turned his attention west. The Columbia District, the territory draining into the Pacific through the Columbia River, encompassing what are now Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho, Montana, and British Columbia, had been administered by the Northwest Company with a lordly indifference to cost that Simpson found appalling when he reviewed the accounts. He made his first visit to the Columbia District in 1824, travelling overland from Hudson Bay to Fort George at the mouth of the Columbia in a journey that required crossing the Rocky Mountains and descending unknown rivers, and that he accomplished at the kind of pace that suggested he was racing his own reputation. What he found at Fort George did not please him. The establishment was too large, too expensive, too focused on maintaining an aristocratic lifestyle for the senior officers at the expense of commercial performance. He ordered it rationalized. He ordered a new headquarters built further up the Columbia at a site he selected himself, Fort Vancouver, on the north bank of the river near the confluence with the Willamette, which became the commercial and administrative capital of the Pacific Northwest for the next 2 decades. Simpson's strategy for the Pacific Northwest included one element of particular strategic sophistication: the deliberate creation of a fur desert south of the Columbia River. The boundary between British and American claims in the Oregon country had not been settled. The area was under joint occupation by agreement, which left the ultimate sovereignty over the region open to negotiation. Simpson understood that the Americans, who were beginning to push through the Rockies in increasing numbers, would eventually assert their claim if the country south of the Columbia was demonstrably worth claiming. His solution was to trap it out. He sent annual Snake Country brigades, mixed parties of HBC men, Indigenous hunters, and Iroquois trappers who had come west with the fur trade, into the Snake River drainage with explicit instructions to take every beaver they could find, to leave nothing that would sustain a commercial fur trade for any potential American competitor. If you could not keep the Americans out, you could at least make sure they arrived to an empty larder. The strategy was environmentally catastrophic and commercially effective, within its own terms. The beaver population of the Snake River drainage was largely eliminated within a generation. The American mountain men who crossed the Rockies found the southern approaches to the Columbia already depleted by the time they arrived in significant numbers. But the strategy could not ultimately stop the tide. The Willamette Valley south of the Columbia was not fur country. It was agricultural country, with a climate and a soil that made it the most productive agricultural land on the Pacific coast, and the American settlers who began arriving along the Oregon Trail in the early 1840s were not looking for beaver. They were looking for farms. The HBC could create a fur desert, but it could not create an agricultural desert, and the farms of the Willamette Valley were the foundation of an American claim to the region that no amount of strategic trapping could undermine. John McLaughlin, the chief factor who administered Fort Vancouver on a day-to-day basis under Simpson's distant supervision, was simultaneously one of Simpson's most effective subordinates and one of his most persistent problems. McLaughlin was a large, physically imposing man, 6'4", white-haired from an early age in a way that gave him a patriarchal appearance that his employees found authoritative and his indigenous trading partners found impressive, with a genuine humanitarian instinct that repeatedly conflicted with the commercial imperatives Simpson was trying to enforce. When American settlers arrived at Fort Vancouver sick, exhausted and destitute after the overland journey, McLaughlin fed them, housed them, provided them with medical care, and gave them credit to get started. Simpson regarded this as both commercially imprudent and strategically disastrous. Every American settler McLaughlin assisted was another nail in the coffin of British claims to the Oregon country. McLaughlin regarded it as what any decent human being would do when confronted with people in genuine need. Both of them were right, and the tension between their positions was not resolvable within the framework that either man was operating in. The Oregon Boundary Settlement of 1846 drew the international line at the 49th parallel, the same latitude that had divided American and British territory east of the Rocky Mountains since 1818, extending it to the Pacific coast. This gave the United States everything south of the 49th parallel, including the Willamette Valley and Fort Vancouver, and Britain everything north of it, including the future province of British Columbia. The HBC's operations south of the new boundary were wound down over the following decade, McLaughlin himself eventually retiring to Oregon City and becoming an American citizen. The company that had effectively governed the Pacific Northwest for 20 years was reduced to the territory north of the 49th parallel. This was still an enormous territory, larger than any European country, but it was a significant contraction from the continental reach that the combined company had achieved at its peak. The indigenous peoples whose lives were transformed by the fur trade were not passive recipients of a commercial system imposed from outside. They were active participants in a set of relationships that offered real benefits alongside the disruptions, and their agency in those relationships was real, even when the structural power imbalance that characterized colonial commerce made that agency constrained in specific ways. Understanding this requires some care because two wrong versions of the story are both common, one in which indigenous peoples were simply exploited, receiving worthless trinkets in exchange for valuable furs, and another in which the exchange was genuinely equal and mutual, a meeting of two commercial traditions on fair terms. Neither is accurate. The trade goods that the HBC offered, iron tools, wool cloth, copper kettles, guns, ammunition, were genuinely valuable to the peoples who received them, not in the colonial mythology of primitive people seduced by bright objects, but in the practical sense that these goods addressed real needs more effectively than the alternatives available. Iron knives and axes were sharper and held their edge longer than stone alternatives. Woolen blankets were warmer and more manageable than some alternatives, especially in wet conditions. Copper kettles were lighter than clay pots, didn't break as easily, and could be used directly over fire. Guns, with their ammunition, extended the effective hunting range and changed the balance of power between peoples who had them and those who did not. The price the Cree and other trading peoples paid was not primarily in the exchange rates at the posts, which were negotiated carefully and with a sophistication that contemporary European commentators sometimes found surprising. It was in the structural consequences of integration into a global commercial economy that operated on terms set in London and Paris, rather than on the shores of Hudson Bay. The fur trade created dependencies on manufactured goods, on food rations provided by the posts, on the commercial relationship itself as a source of the weapons and tools that hunting with European firearms required. Communities that had developed deep integration with the fur trade over generations found that when the trade changed, when beaver became scarce, when fashion changed, when the company restructured its operations, the adjustment was profoundly disruptive in ways that the communities had not anticipated and the company had not designed for. The epidemic disease that travelled with the trade is the factor whose scale and consequences are most difficult to fully comprehend. But before arriving at the epidemics, the more immediate cultural transformations of the trade economy deserve attention because they unfolded in ways that were not invisible at the time and that the HBC's own records document with a specificity that makes the company's choices visible. The company's earliest factors understood, from direct observation, that the trade was creating changes in Indigenous life that were not purely beneficial. The competition for access to European goods, and particularly to firearms, which transformed the military and hunting balance between peoples who had them and those who did not, was driving patterns of warfare and displacement that the company did not cause, but that its commercial presence consistently intensified. The Cree expansion westward across the prairies in the 17th and 18th centuries, the movement of a people from their original territories around Hudson Bay onto the buffalo plains of what is now Saskatchewan and Manitoba, was driven partly by the commercial advantage of being close to the HBC posts and partly by the military advantage that early access to European firearms gave them relative to peoples further from the posts. The displacement of the Assiniboine, the Blackfoot, and other plains peoples from territories they had previously occupied was connected, causally if complexly, to the differential distribution of European trade goods along the HBC's commercial network. The company's policy toward the peoples it traded with was not one of deliberate displacement. Its commercial interests were best served by stable, populous, commercially active Indigenous communities. A society that had collapsed could not bring furs to the post, but the indirect consequences of the trade were catastrophic in ways that a commercial logic focused on the annual fur returns was not equipped to perceive or prevent. The company's responses to epidemic disease, when epidemics were severe enough to be reported in the factor's journals, were limited to the conventional medicine of the period, which was largely ineffective, and to the provision of food to communities too sick to hunt for themselves, which was genuinely helpful at the margin. What the company did not do, and what the state of knowledge of the period did not yet make possible for anyone to do, was understand the disease dynamics well enough to take preventive action. The epidemic of 1780 to 1782, smallpox that swept across the Western Plains and subarctic in a wave of mortality that the HBC's own records, the journals of Northwest Company traders, and the oral traditions of multiple Indigenous nations all document, was by any measure one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in the history of North America. Estimates of mortality in specific communities range from 50% to 90% of the pre-epidemic population, and the geographic spread of the epidemic reached from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic coast, following the trade and travel networks of the continent with a remorselessness that no human institution of the period could have tracked or interrupted. The HBC's trading returns for the years immediately following the epidemic show the commercial consequences in their starkest form. The furs stopped coming to the posts, not because the animals were scarce, but because the people who trapped them and brought them to the post were dead. Smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, the epidemic diseases of European civilization, spread through Indigenous populations along the same networks that carried trade goods, and the mortality rates in populations with no prior exposure and no immune experience of these diseases were catastrophic. Individual epidemic events reduced specific community populations by 50, 70, even 90% in short periods. The demographic collapse of the subarctic and plains Indigenous populations in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was not a single event, but a series of waves, each devastating, never giving the surviving populations enough time to rebuild before the next wave arrived. The fur trade did not cause the epidemics deliberately. The company had no interest in killing the people who provided its commercial foundation, but the commercial networks of the trade were the vector through which the diseases spread, and the company's consistent failure to grapple with this reality, while the trade was at its height, is one of the most uncomfortable dimensions of its history. The Métis, the people who emerged from the unions between European fur traders and Indigenous women that the trade-specific social dynamics produced, occupied a position in the HBC's world that was simultaneously central to its operation and marginal to its governance. The children of these unions grew up with knowledge of both worlds, fluent in Indigenous languages and in French or English, skilled in the specific physical and logistical arts of the fur trade, possessing the kinship ties to Indigenous communities that made them effective intermediaries, and educated in European commercial and religious culture through the missions and schools that accompanied the trade. By the early 19th century, the Métis were not simply the mixed-race children of individual relationships. They were a distinct people with their own language, Michif, a remarkable fusion of Cree and French, their own social institutions, their own relationship to the land of the Red River Valley that was their primary homeland, and their own growing awareness of their collective identity and interests. When the HBC sold Rupert's Land to the Government of Canada in 1869, the Métis of the Red River were not consulted. They were not mentioned in the transaction documents. The land on which they had lived for generations, farming their distinctive riverlot strips along the Red and Assiniboine rivers, was transferred from one set of distant governors, the London shareholders of the HBC, to another set of distant governors, the politicians of Ottawa, without any acknowledgement that the people actually inhabiting that land had a voice in its future. The surveyors who arrived in 1869 to divide the territory into the township grid that the Canadian government preferred for settlement came without warning, without consultation, and without recognition of the Métis land tenure system that had organised the Red River settlements for decades. Louis Riel was 24 years old in 1869. He was Métis, educated in Montreal, fluent in French and English and Michif, and possessed of a political intelligence and a personal charisma that made him the natural leader of the resistance that the Métis community organised in response to the survey. On October 11th, 1869, a group of Métis men, Riel among them, stopped the government surveyors physically, standing on the survey chain and refusing to allow it to be moved forward across Métis land. The gesture was deliberate and theatrical, and entirely effective in communicating the Métis position. They were not going to accept a transfer of their homeland conducted without their knowledge or consent. Within weeks, the Métis had organised a provisional government, seized Upper Fort Garry, the main HBC trading post in the Red River region, which housed the administrative apparatus of the company's local government, and were negotiating with Ottawa for the terms on which the Red River Territory would join Confederation. The negotiations resulted in the Manitoba Act of 1870, which admitted the Red River region as the province of Manitoba, guaranteed official status for the French language alongside English, protected the existing land rights of the existing settlers, and, in one of the more significant provisions, reserved 1.4 million acres of land for the children of Métis families as recognition of their specific connection to the territory. The Métis list of rights that Riel's provisional government had submitted to Ottawa was substantially, if not completely, addressed. The Red River resistance was, by the standards of colonial encounters, a remarkable success. A community that had been entirely overlooked in a $1.5 million real estate transaction had organised itself, negotiated from strength and extracted meaningful protections for its rights from a government that had initially intended to simply absorb it. The tragedy came afterward, when the implementation of the Manitoba Act's promises fell far short of what the Act itself had guaranteed. The land grant to Métis children was administered corruptly and incompetently. Many Métis families lost their land to speculators who bought their scrip certificates at a fraction of face value. The influx of English-Canadian settlers from Ontario, motivated by precisely the agricultural opportunity that the Red River Valley offered, transformed the demographics of Manitoba within a decade, making the Métis a minority in what had briefly been their own province. Riel himself was forced into exile after the execution of Thomas Scott, an Ontario Protestant who had repeatedly defied the authority of the provisional government and was court-martialed and shot, a decision that made Riel a hero in French Catholic Quebec and a murderer in English Protestant Ontario, and that divided Canadian opinion in ways that made his political survival impossible. Riel returned to the Northwest 15 years later, in 1885, to lead another Métis resistance, this time in the Saskatchewan country, to which many Métis had relocated after the loss of their Manitoba lands. And this time the outcome was different. The Canadian Pacific Railway, which had been completed to the prairies in 1885, allowed the federal government to move troops west in days rather than months, overwhelming the Métis military capacity that had been adequate in 1870. Riel was captured, tried for high treason, and hanged in Regina in November 1885. His execution confirmed a fault line in Canadian national politics that had opened with the Red River Resistance, and that, in various forms, has never fully closed. The sale of Rupert's Land in 1869 marked the beginning of the HBC's transformation from a territorial power into something else. But the character of what came before that sale, the specific nature of HBC authority in the territory during the 2 centuries it held it, deserves more careful examination than it usually receives, because the company was neither a simple commercial operation nor a conventional colonial government. It was something genuinely new, an institution for which the available categories were inadequate. The governance of Rupert's Land under the HBC was conducted through a system whose formal structure was defined by the original charter and by subsequent legislation, and whose practical reality was defined by the enormous distances involved, the limited number of company employees actually present in the territory, and the central role of Indigenous and Métis people in everything the company did. The formal authority of the company included the power to make laws, to hold courts, and to exercise executive authority over all persons within the territory. In practice, the company's judicial and executive functions were exercised only in and around its trading posts, and the vast majority of the territory, the land between the posts, the hunting grounds, the winter camps, the plains and forests and tundra that made up the overwhelming bulk of Rupert's Land, was governed by the Indigenous peoples who lived in it, according to their own laws and customs, with the company's trading relationship as the primary point of contact. The Council of Assiniboia, which administered the Red River settlement from 1835 onward, was the closest thing Rupert's Land had to a functioning colonial government, a body of appointed members, including representatives of the major population groups of the settlement, that handled local legislation and adjudication. It was not democratic in any meaningful sense, but it was also not entirely unresponsive to the population it governed. It included Métis members alongside English and Scottish settlers and HBC officials, and its records show genuine deliberation about local conditions and local needs, rather than simply the imposition of external authority. It was, by the standards of the mid-19th century, a reasonably functional small jurisdiction government for the specific community of the Red River settlement. It was not a government for the 2 million people of Rupert's Land more broadly, because there were not facilities, personnel, or political will to build such a government. When the Canadian government bought Rupert's Land, it was buying this. Not a governed territory with established administrative infrastructure, but a commercial claim over an enormous landmass, most of which was governed by the people who lived in it through their own institutions, and which had been incorporated into the administrative apparatus of a distant metropolitan power only in the specific loci of the HBC's trading posts. The transfer was not a transfer of an existing colonial government to a new metropolitan power. It was the creation of a new governmental claim over a territory that had never been fully governed by the previous claimant. The Canadian government's subsequent challenge, how to actually administer and develop this enormous territory, was substantially harder than the purchase price of $1.5 million suggested. The first HBC retail store opened in Winnipeg in 1881, a general merchandise establishment aimed at the settlers flooding into the newly opened Western Territory on the railroad lines that Canadian Confederation was building with deliberate purpose. The trading post model, the store where you could get everything you needed for life in the territory, from flour and tobacco to tools and cloth, was not entirely unlike what the trading post had always been. But the customer base had changed. The Indigenous and Métis traders who had been the company's commercial partners for 2 centuries were being displaced by European settlers whose shopping habits and commercial expectations were very different, and the company's retail model evolved to serve the new demographic rather than the old one. The point blanket that became one of the company's most iconic products was originally a trade good developed for exactly this trading post context. A heavy wool blanket that Indigenous peoples found genuinely useful, and that the company had been producing in standard weights and sizes since the early 18th century. The characteristic striped design, cream with stripes of green, red, yellow, and indigo, appears to have developed over time, with the specific colour combination becoming standardised in the 19th century, and eventually becoming so closely associated with the company and with Canada that it achieved the status of a national symbol. The point blanket is still produced today, the same design, the same weights, the same colours, one of the most direct material continuities between the HBC's fur trade past and its retail present, or rather its retail past, since the retail stores are now closed. By the mid-20th century, the Hudson's Bay Company had become one of the dominant retail chains of Canadian commerce. But the 50-year period between the Rupert's Land transfer in 1870 and the full establishment of the retail model deserves attention, because it was during this period that the company completed its transformation from a territorial power into a commercial one, a transformation that was neither smooth nor fully successful. The company entered the 1870s with its commercial character fundamentally uncertain. The fur trade, which has been the economic foundation of the entire enterprise for 200 years, was declining, though not dead. The beaver hat was gone, but other furs remained in demand, and the Hudson Bay Basin still held populations of beaver, otter, marten, mink and fox that were commercially significant even if they were a fraction of what they had been a century earlier. The company maintained its network of fur trading posts throughout the late 19th century, adapting gradually to the changed environment by shifting toward the provision of general goods to the settlers who were flooding into the Canadian West along the railroad lines, and by establishing the general store model that the first Winnipeg store of 1881 represented. The late 19th century HBC was also a significant landowner, one of the largest in Canada, as a result of the provision of the Rupert's Land Transfer that had reserved approximately 7 million acres of fertile prairie for the company's own benefit. The disposition of this land through the following decades, sold off in parcels to settlers and speculators as the Canadian Pacific Railway, made prairie land accessible and agricultural land valuable, was one of the primary financial activities of the company and one of its more successful ones. Land that had been essentially worthless when the transfer was negotiated became enormously valuable as settlement turned the prairie into productive farmland, and the company's systematic disposal of its land holdings over the decades from the 1880s to the 1930s generated revenues that sustained the organization through the transition to retail. The company's role in the broader project of Canadian Confederation, the westward extension of the Canadian state from its initial eastern core to the Pacific coast, was not merely commercial. The HBC's infrastructure of posts and routes and relationships with Indigenous peoples was the foundation on which the Canadian government's Western administration was built. The numbered treaties that Canada negotiated with the Indigenous peoples of the Prairie and Subarctic between 1871 and 1921 were conducted in many cases at or near HBC post locations, with HBC factors serving as translators, witnesses, or informal advisors. The company's decades of commercial relationships with Indigenous peoples gave it knowledge that the Canadian government needed and that it could provide, and the provision of that knowledge, whether explicit or implicit, was one of the ways in which the HBC's colonial history was woven into the Canadian state's colonial history in ways that continue to be litigated today. The decline that ended in the bankruptcy filing of March 2025 was not sudden. It was the cumulative product of 2 decades of strategic misjudgments, ownership changes, capital extraction, and failure to adapt to a retail environment that was transforming around the company, while the company's management watched without adequate urgency. The rise of online commerce changed the structural economics of physical retail in ways that eliminated the advantages that large downtown department stores had always relied on. The convenience of one-stop shopping in a central location, the breadth of inventory in a single building, the brand associations that drew customers who might not know exactly what they wanted. All of these advantages disappeared or were severely diminished when the same customer could browse a vastly larger inventory online, compare prices instantly, and have the purchase delivered to their door without visiting the store at all. The specific ownership trajectory of the company in its final decades added layers of difficulty. The company was taken private by a consortium including an American-based private equity firm in 2006, and the subsequent years saw a series of acquisitions. The Lord & Taylor department store chain in the United States, Germany's Galeria Kaufhof, a partnership with the Saks Fifth Avenue brand that expanded the company's footprint while also expanding its debt load and dividing management attention between multiple brands and multiple markets. The European acquisitions were divested by 2019, having generated losses. The Lord & Taylor acquisition ended in that chain's bankruptcy in 2020. The Saks Fifth Avenue relationship generated its own complications. Each strategic pivot left the company more financially encumbered and less focused than before. When the CCA filing came in March 2025, the company owed more than $1.1 billion to creditors ranging from landlords who had not been paid rent to suppliers who had not been paid for goods to tax authorities who were owed years of arrears. The stores were physically deteriorating. Deferred maintenance had allowed the flagship buildings in multiple cities to fall into a state of disrepair that was visible to customers and that had been driving away shoppers and prompting landlords to begin planning for alternative tenants even before the bankruptcy announcement. Attempts to find a buyer willing to take on the HBC retail operations failed. By April 2025, the remaining stores were liquidating. By June, the last stores had closed. By July, the 355-year institutional life of the company, in its retail incarnation, was over. Canadian Tire acquired the intellectual property, including the HBC brand and the right to use the name and the iconic striped design. Whether those assets will be used to launch a new HBC-branded retail venture, or whether they will sit in a corporate portfolio as a legacy acquisition, was not determined at the time of this writing. The beaver is still on the Canadian nickel. The Rupert's land that the company once governed is still distributed among the Canadian provinces and territories. The Indigenous and Métis peoples whose histories were so profoundly shaped by the company's 2 centuries of territorial governance are still asserting the treaty rights and land claims that those histories generated. The company was not simply a store. It was not even simply a fur trading monopoly. And in the middle decades of the 19th century, it was briefly the administrative body closest to one of the century's most dramatic disasters, the Franklin expedition, and to the subsequent searches that brought the Arctic into public consciousness as nothing had before. Sir John Franklin departed England in 1845 with 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, and 128 men, on what was intended to be the final expedition to complete the mapping of the Northwest Passage. Franklin was 60 when he left, and had a distinguished naval career behind him. His ships were the most technologically advanced expedition vessels ever sent into the Arctic, steam-powered, with retractable screw propellers and keels reinforced for ice work, carrying 3 years' worth of provisions. Neither ship nor man returned. The entire expedition was consumed by the Arctic. The ships became trapped in the ice off King William Island in 1846 and were never freed. Franklin died in June 1847. The remaining men abandoned the ships in April 1848 and attempted to walk south to safety across the barren lands of the Canadian Arctic. None survived. The discovery of what had happened to the Franklin expedition involved over 40 subsequent expeditions across more than a decade, and the HBC was involved in several of them, not as a principal organisation, but as the logistical infrastructure that made Arctic search operations possible. The company's network of posts in the subarctic provided supply depots for search parties, and HBC men served as guides and interpreters for expeditions that needed local knowledge to operate. The ultimate determination of the expedition's fate came partly through the Inuit oral tradition. Inuit witnesses who had encountered the dying survivors told investigators what they had seen with a detail and an accuracy that was initially dismissed, and then, as physical evidence accumulated, recognized as the most reliable record available. The Franklin expedition story, its disappearance, the decade of searches, the gradual reconstruction of what had happened through Inuit testimony, written records found in cairns, and eventually the archaeological discovery of the wreck sites in 2014 and 2016, is one of the great narratives of the 19th century Arctic, and the HBC sits at its edges as the organisation that made continuous human presence in the subarctic possible. The company was not simply a store. It was not even simply a fur trading monopoly. It was, for 200 years, a kind of government, imperfect, self-interested, extractive, occasionally brutal, and also, in its specific context, genuinely constitutive of the institutions and relationships that made the Canadian West possible as a human community. The posts that the company built became the towns that became the cities. The river routes that the company's brigades paddled became the highways and railways. The treaties that the company negotiated became the legal foundation of Indigenous land relationships with the Crown. The Métis people that the trade created became a nation. The land that the company sold to Canada in 1869 became the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. The 355 years of the company's history are not separable from the history of the country it inhabited, and the bankruptcy of 2025 is not the end of that entanglement. It is simply the most recent chapter in a story whose earlier chapters are still generating consequences. The night is settling around you now, and the long story of the Hudson's Bay Company has reached the end we can give it, which is the end of the retail stores, the bankruptcy, the liquidation, but not the end of the history, which continues in the land claims and the treaty negotiations and the archaeological sites, and the oral traditions of the peoples who were here before the company and who are here after it. The beaver that the company nearly drove to extinction is still in the rivers of the Canadian subarctic. The posts that the company built are mostly ruins now. York Factory abandoned in 1957. Its great wooden buildings slowly sinking into the permafrost that sustained them for 3 centuries. A National Historic Site maintained at minimal expense and accessible only by float plane or boat. The point blankets are still being produced somewhere, under whatever arrangement Canadian Tire has made for the brand. The story began with 2 French fur traders in trouble with the colonial authorities, pitching a scheme to a prince who understood it, and a king who signed a charter, and a ship called the Nonsuch that sailed into the subarctic in 1668, and came back with enough beaver pelts to make a generation of English investors wealthy enough to keep the enterprise going. It continued through the wars with France and the treaty that ended them, through the rivalry with the Northwest Company and the violence that ended it, through the imperial administration of George Simpson and the strategic brilliance and moral compromises that characterized it, through the sale of Rupert's land and the resistance of the Métis and the execution of Louis Riel, through the transformation into retail and the slow decline and the bankruptcy. The beaver hat went out of fashion in the 1840s. The company it had called into existence outlasted it by nearly 2 centuries. That is worth noting. The institution created to serve a fashion trend survived the fashion trend by generations, reinventing itself at each juncture where the original purpose became inadequate, until the final reinvention failed and the 355 years came to their end. In the summer of 2025, if you walked past the location of a former Hudson's Bay store in a Canadian city, the building still there, the signage removed or in the process of removal, the windows covered with paper or advertising some new tenancy, you were walking past the specific material end of a specific institutional life that had begun in 1670 on the shore of Hudson Bay. The company had survived d'Iberville's naval raids and the Pemmican War and the loss of Rupert's land and the collapse of the fur trade in 2 world wars. It did not survive Amazon. Let that settle around you now. The subarctic is dark tonight, and the rivers are running under their ice to Hudson Bay, carrying the drainage of a continent toward a sea that has been doing this since before any human being walked its shores. The York Factory buildings are tilting slowly into the permafrost. The point blankets are folded in their storage somewhere. The Nonsuch, or rather the replica of the Nonsuch that was built for the HBC's tercentenary in 1970, and that sailed across the Atlantic and back, is on display in Winnipeg at the Manitoba Museum, 50 feet long and remarkably small for a ship that changed the history of a continent. Rest easy.